Good afternoon. I'm Shep Steiner, Associate Professor of Modern Contemporary Art at the School of Art and editor of the journal Mosaic at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Thank you for joining us today for this lecture by philosopher and poet Jan Zwicky, Dr. Jan Zwicky, who is joining us from the University of Victoria. She is Professor Emerita in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Victoria, and we'd like to thank the team at the university who has helped set up the online portion of this event. In this regard, we and they would also like to acknowledge the Lekwung, Songhees, Esquimalt, Osaanich peoples on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwung and Osaanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Dr. Zwicky's lecture is part of a series of 8 events titled Suicides, Ecocides. Mosaic began hosting last year with visits by Doctors Michael Marder and Gary Sherbert and a lecture by Sadana Fief. Events will continue next week with Alan Clayson and into February and March with Doctors Andrei Varminsky, Michael Krimper, and Banu Bargu. These events are hosted on traditional territories as well, and here I would acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses and research spaces are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Inninewak, Assinininewak, Dakota, Ayat, Dene, and Inuit, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. UM recognizes that the treaties signed on these lands are a lifelong, enduring relationship, and we are dedicated to upholding their spirit and intent. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present. With this understanding, we commit to supporting Indigenous excellence through active reconciliation, meaningful change, and the creation of an environment where everyone can thrive. Our collaboration with Indigenous communities is grounded in respect and reciprocity, and this guides how we move forward as an institution. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsors, which includes Mosaic, the Office of the President, the Faculty of Graduate Studies, the School of Art, the Department of Religion, Sociology, Political Science, and History, and the University of Manitoba Institute for the Humanities. So to our speaker. We're very fortunate that Dr. Zwicky is joining us today. We have a lot to learn from her work that crosses so many disciplinary boundaries and scales of reference. She's the author of many essays, books on philosophy, of poetry and art. Music and the resonance it has for us are important in all. I'll name only a few of her books to give you an idea of what a wide-ranging thinker, writer, and poet we are with. There is Wittgenstein's Elegies from 86, Lyric Philosophy from 92, Songs for Relinquishing the Earth from 96, for which she won the Governor General's Award for Poetry, and so on, up to Learning to Die, Wisdom in the Age of Climate Crisis from 2018, which she co-authored with Robert Bringhurst. Once Upon a Time in the West from 2023, and only a few weeks ago, she, along with Gareth Martin, performed a reading of a new long poem titled Say It. Dr. Zwicky tells me her lecture today is not unrelated to Say It. Her poetry, her philosophy, her deep understanding of ecology, and her stay-at-home ethic and politic are all inseparably correlative. Thinking like an ecosystem, which is Robert Bringhurst's phrase from Learning to Die, is a poetic undertaking that involves choosing to vacation at home, which is Zwicky's phrase, and a way of saying far more than the use of the phrase itself lets on. This is perhaps too lighthearted for the subject of today's talk, titled Contemplating Cataclysm, but I think it may help us all think upstream with our speaker. Please welcome Jan Zwicky.
Thanks immensely, Shep, and many thanks to you for this invitation, to Mosaic for all the administrative support. My thanks also to UVic for their support here. And thank you especially for the acknowledgement. That's one of the most meaningful ones I have heard, and I really appreciate it. Contemplating Cataclysm. We belong to a species that is committing planetary ecocide. Globally, with few exceptions, members of culture after culture now pursue a picture of the good life characterized by unfettered consumerism, idleness, and distraction, all of which are supported by relentless exploitation of the natural world, particularly by the mining, processing, and burning of fossil fuels. We're not the first humans to confront our own species' capacity for evil on a cultural scale, but we are the first to witness it on a planetary, biospheric level. The scope of the cataclysm is staggering. It taxes the limits of the imagination. It overwhelms many of us with grief, bewilderment, and rage. How do we stand up inside the knowledge of human responsibility for planetary biospheric collapse? What could constitute moral integrity in this appalling situation? In his book, A Good War, Seth Klein proposed an answer. He argued that we should, as citizens, acknowledge the severity of the crisis and demand that our governments mobilize in a war against climate change. In January 2021, the David Suzuki Institute took him up on his proposal. The Institute provided backing for a 5-year initiative called the Climate Emergency Unit, aimed at putting Canada on a climate wartime footing. The unit's goal was not to organize individuals under its own banner, but to, quote, cajole other organizations and institutions into emergency mode in order to collectively build a drumbeat for genuine climate action and policy, end quote. To this end, they convened meetings with health groups, faith groups, labor, business and youth groups, arts collectives, broadcast media, and community organizations to communicate a sense of urgency. They also met with politicians and civil servants in numerous settings, hoping to influence government directly. In December 2025, the unit released its final report. It is a bracingly honest document. It states that on every count but one, the unit's initiatives failed. The one partial success was the formation of a youth climate corps, which managed to receive 2% of the government funding for which its members had campaigned. They'd asked for $1 billion a year and received 40 million over 2 years. Going forward, the Corps will use these funds primarily to lobby for more money. Why was the emergency unit's failure so complete? Why did efforts to communicate a sense of urgency to all those groups fail to gain traction or bog down or peter out? One obvious reason is the profound extent of government capture by the fossil fuel industry, forcibly documented in Kevin Taft's book, Oil's Deep State. Imperatives dictated by this capture now stymie attempts on the part of community initiatives to get through to government. Another reason is that war on climate change is not possible. Humans are entirely willing to take an aggressive stance towards other human beings, and they happily constitute themselves as genocidal tribes with minimal prompting. In this, they're no different from many other animals. But failing the appearance of some other against which they can identify themselves as members of a right group, there will be no sustained interest in collaborative warlike action. Thus, although I respect the idea that focused large-scale government action has been the most likely possibility for averting cataclysm, I'm not surprised that we haven't seen it. And I don't think we will. The battle that is needed is not against the abstract idea of climate change. What was needed, was a battle against our own proclivities, wanting stuff, wanting more stuff, wanting more than enough stuff, wanting never to have to work, wanting distraction in the idleness engendered by the absence of work, wanting sex, wanting power, wanting, like other great apes, a superior position in the social pecking order. The Climate Emergency Unit developed a list of indicators that a government is engaging with the climate crisis in emergency mode. The third item on that list is especially telling in this regard. It says that a government is in emergency mode when it, quote, shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures, end quote. This is an acknowledgement that self-restraint won't occur in a large enough swath of the population, even when you tell them the truth about how bad things are or dangle a carrot in front of them. This observation is supported by the British experience in World War II. The government conducted surveys during the war to gauge public response to rationing. A report filed with the Public Record Office in 1942 documents, quote, complete and expressed unwillingness to make voluntary sacrifices, but an apparent readiness to face compulsory sacrifices without undue grumbling, end quote. Why no willingness to make voluntary sacrifices? Didn't individuals believe the war effort was worthwhile? Apparently they did, but the prospect of defeating fascism, even in the context of a real war against another tribe, was not enough to galvanize self-restraint. The tendency to prioritize material satisfactions and to take more than we need runs very deep in our nature. It shows up in the 6th century BCE in the one surviving fragment from the Greek philosopher Anaximander. It shows up in the 2nd or 1st century BCE in the Bhagavad Gita, which describes this tendency as the worst enemy of humanity. It also shows up in cautionary stories in the oral literatures of indigenous societies in pre-contact North America. We need not look far afield to see it in action today. I said a battle against the human proclivity to take too much was what was needed, because time for an effective address to cataclysm has run out. There is now no possibility of constraining global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Human population growth is slowing in many countries, to the terror of economists who foresee an end to endlessly expanding GDP, but it is not slowing anywhere near fast enough, given everyone's aspiration to a lifestyle rooted in overexploitation. The effect of having done nothing to rein in the fossil fuel development over the last 60 years means that the industry retains a global chokehold on economic possibilities for dealing with a rogue US administration. It is time to face the fact that we are not going to solve the climate crisis. Let us then return to our original question in the light of this acknowledgement. Is there any possibility of achieving moral integrity in the context of unfolding planetary cataclysm wrought by our own species? Is there any point? What is moral integrity? Well, first, what's integrity? No moral attached. The noun's root is the Latin integer, meaning whole, complete, undivided, whence the English word integer, meaning a so-called whole number. Integer itself is related to tangere, to touch. So in its most originary sense, integer means untouched, with, I suspect, connotations of virginity in females. Integrity in current usage is related to integral, meaning something necessary to completeness, and to integrate, to form or make into a whole. As a human being, then, to pursue integrity would be to pursue wholeness or undividedness. Our actions, our beliefs about what is valuable, our thoughts, our gestures and desires would be fully coordinated with one another. They would not be in tension or at odds. There would be no acting in bad faith. Now we can see that there's actually no possibility of achieving integrity, moral or otherwise, through mandatory government restrictions. Integrity cannot be imposed from the outside. It is a matter of internal coherence, or of what some philosophers have called internal relations. Reliance on an external authority to coordinate action and belief is like being goo constrained by a mold. Integrity requires a spine. The analogy runs deep. We often say of people with integrity that they stand up for what they believe in, including standing up to authority when necessary. Authority can take many forms. It can mean the will of an unpopular few enforced at gunpoint. It can mean a legal bureaucracy maintained by an elected government. And it can mean social pressure, often internalized as the so-called compulsion to comply, a felt need to hang with the herd, no matter what non-compliant notion or desire might flicker briefly across one's consciousness. Our problem with integrity in the face of human ecocide arises in this last authoritarian context, the social one. There is no mafia big enough to take on our species as a whole. Some might wish to cast the biosphere itself in this role, but that would be a mistake. The biosphere, good cosmic citizen that it is, will simply continue to unfold implacably according to natural law. We've seen that attempts to stand up to government inaction, that is to prod government into acting, have failed and are likely to continue to do so. It is then the compulsion to comply, our need to fit in with everyone else participating in the consumerist juggernaut, that should focus our attempts to achieve integrity. And it is indeed resistance to community norms that we see in actions that we regard, at least retrospectively, as models of great integrity. Socrates, refusing to be bought off by Athenian demagogues and paying with his life. Mistahimasqua, attempting to preserve Cree cultural values and at the same time attempting to prevent violence by Crees against settlers, and paying through imprisonment and subsequently dying of illness contracted while in prison. Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her seat on the bus and suffering lifelong persecution. In such cases, we see people standing up to social pressure, resisting at great personal risk the ethos that governs their community. Plato's 2,400-year-old dialogue Republic is of remarkable interest in its context. At its center is the ancient Greek concept of pleonexia. Depending on context, pleonexia can connote simple greediness, or it can connote greediness that leads to debility, or it can mean taking what isn't yours in order to display male prowess. This last, pleonexia as a conception of male excellence, is alive and well today. It fires wars and decadent extravagance while it sanctions domestic violence and shady backroom deals. Plato's dialogue is concerned with the nature of justice, and it sets the question in terms of this third sense of pleonexia, the view that might makes right. Plato's argument that might does not make right conceives of justice as a harmonious coordination of the parts of the soul, and he contends that pleonexia, because it involves wanting more than you need, is disfiguring. In other words, he argues that the third manly sense of pleonexia entails the second debilitating sense. Plato argues that pleonectic desire throws both the individual soul and the state into disarray. It makes justice impossible unless it is brought under control, either by self-restraint or by state coercion. The dialogue also offers a striking description of standing up to socially endorsed habits of thought and behavior. Many will be familiar with its most famous episode, in which Plato compares uneducated humans to prisoners in a cave. He asks us to imagine ourselves constrained from childhood by fetters that keep us facing one of the walls of the cave. Behind us is a great fire, which we can't see, and between the fire and our backs is a low wall, above which puppeteers raise images of various objects, animals, human beings, some of which appear to be speaking. These images, because of the fire, cast shadows on the wall in front of us, and we take those images for reality since we've experienced nothing else. Plato then asks us to consider the experience of someone released from their fetters, who is forced to stand up. That's exactly how he puts it. turn around and look at the fire, and who was then dragged up out of the cave and exposed to sunlight. The experience would be painful. The light would be dazzling, and the unfettered prisoner would be disoriented until they got used to it. But, according to Plato, it's only by such standing up and turning around that they could come to grasp reality. The analogy to acquiring moral integrity in the face of biospheric cataclysm is not exact. Plato is concerned partly to engage our intuitions with his case for the existence of an ideal realm, which he argues is more real than the one we experience through embodied perception. I don't myself think such a realm exists. However, the analogy construed broadly remains morally potent. What is it that forces us to stand up? Plato doesn't say in Republic. He says only that we are compelled. But in a dialogue called Symposium, he argues that what produces genuine human excellence, which we may read as moral integrity, is love of abstract beauty. And he claims that beholding this divine beauty means that we're in contact with truth. Truth, beauty, and the good are inseparable, Plato claims. They stand in internal relations to one another. Together, they constitute an integrated whole. I'd like to suggest that what pulls us to our feet in situations of social challenge is a desire for truth, a desire to tell the truth, to live truthfully, and a simultaneous awareness of two things: a sense, perhaps dim, perhaps fleeting, that living truthfully is somehow necessary, and also a sense that something about what our community takes for granted is wrong. We stop caring about what everybody else thinks. We want to know what really is the case, or more, we do know what is the case, and we decide to say it. Particularly in higher education over the last few decades, and now increasingly in politics and through social media, there's been a tendency to regard social norms as inviolable, and a corresponding attempt to, or pressure rather, to give up on truth. But I'm with Plato. The truth is often hard to discern. Sometimes it's very hard to discern, and we can get it wrong. But this does not mean that truth does not exist. And I'm also with Plato in thinking that a robust conception of truth is essential to any conception of the good as something other than merely what your neighbors think. I'll come back to the question of why we might desire truth and what might be involved in sensing its necessity after a little more discussion of truth's role in pursuing moral integrity in the context of biospheric cataclysm. Here, now, part of the truth is that humans are destroying the planetary biosphere. Another part is that the biosphere they are destroying is beautiful, and that's what makes their actions wrong. And yet another part is that many of us duck responsibility for our actions. We say there's an environmental crisis. We say it's terrible. We say it's caused by too many humans producing too much pollution, cutting down too many forests, generating too many emissions from mining and burning fossil fuels. And yet we've done little or nothing to bring our own behavior into line with these claims. In other words, we act as though what we say isn't true. We lack integrity. How do we go about acquiring it? The first step involves telling ourselves the truth, owning our complicity in biospheric cataclysm. This task will share features with admitting to substance addiction. In particular, many of us will have to overcome denial. But there are two important differences between owning complicity in biospheric collapse and admitting we have a substance addiction. The first is that we usually won't be able to see our complicity until we undertake a serious inventory of our behavior. Unlike fallout from substance addiction, the fallout from complicity in overexploitation and overconsumption is not immediately apparent in the wreckage of our personal lives. The second important difference is that some complicity may be unwilling. We're not in denial. We'd be delighted to change, and we're willing to make significant sacrifices to do so. But our efforts are blocked at every turn because the economy is in thrall to exploitative capitalist interests. But where participation is not forced on us, how do we go about owning our acquiescence in biospheric damage? What does the inventory we need to undertake look like? There are three basic steps: a grasp of the comprehensive nature of the crises that characterize biospheric collapse, an understanding of the basic drivers of these crises, and then acknowledgement of individual actions that contribute to the drivers. First, the crises. Ocean acidification, extensive wildfires, drought, extreme heat events, extreme rainfall events, extreme storms, melting permafrost, which of course releases more methane, melting glaciers and ice caps, which reduce albedo effect, disruption of basic climate systems like the jet stream and the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which includes the Gulf Stream, rising sea levels, degradation of soils, water shortages, water pollution, plastic pollution, nanoplastic pollution, biodiversity loss, now emerging as a sixth mass extinction. Second, the drivers of these intertwined crises. An expanding human population that collectively aspires to energy-intensive, luxurious lifestyles. Industrial farming, widespread use of pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides. Shipping, storage, and global distribution of foodstuffs. Mining, manufacturing, shipping and global distribution of manufactured goods, groundwater depletion, deforestation, and other forms of habitat destruction owing to urban, industrial, and especially agricultural expansion. Pursuit of excessive profit by pleonectic capitalists who employ manipulative advertising and marketing techniques to boost demand for unnecessary items. Human susceptibility to such advertising and marketing. And finally, net increases in greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. The drivers are themselves intertwined. Net increases in greenhouse gas emissions are the direct physical cause of many of the crises, but they remain inseparable from expanding numbers of human consumers in a capitalist global economy that refuses to relinquish its dependence on fossil fuels. Here is an example involving connections among all four drivers. The Ogallala Aquifer, an enormous store of groundwater underlying the American plains, is rapidly being diminished by pumping for irrigation. The demand for irrigation is increasing because drought is increasing and industrial agriculture is expanding. One of the main crops being irrigated is corn, which is used in the manufacture of high fructose corn syrup, which in turn is used to produce junk food. No one needs junk food for nutrition, but advertising depicts its consumption as basic to having a good time. The drivers taken together have a rough measure in the concept of ecological overshoot, the degree to which human exploitation exceeds the capacity of natural systems to regenerate. In 2025, the day the Earth as a whole went into ecological overshoot was June 24th. If everyone lived as they do in Qatar, the projected date for 2026 overshoot would be February 4th. If everyone lived as they do in Canada, it would be March 8th. Rising greenhouse gas emissions are a critical aspect of overshoot, and detailed analyses are provided by a number of research initiatives. Some people imagine that if we had paid attention to the numbers for emissions from each sector, this would have helped us target what we needed to do, or that it might still show us what we should address now. But it's not clear that the numbers help because, again, the sectors are intertwined. Emissions from transportation, for example, would at this time be impossible without emissions from the mining and processing of fossil fuels. One imagines. We just need to convert the fleet to electric vehicles. Except emissions from coal-fired generation of electricity in 2023 were a whopping 20% of the global total. Oh, that's China's problem, some will say, and they're working to address it. The last part is true, but the first part isn't. Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick still generate significant quantities of electricity by burning coal. Although Alberta now generates most of its electricity by burning natural gas, itself is the source of greenhouse gas emissions, it remains home to the largest thermal coal mine in Canada, Coalspur Mine's Vista project, which exports coal to Asian electricity markets. In 2024, a proposal to expand this mine was exempted from a federal impact assessment. If the Alberta Energy Regulator approves the expansion, Vista will become the largest thermal coal mine in North America. To further complicate matters, contributions from specific sectors rarely constitute more than 5 or 6% of total emissions. In 2023, residential buildings contributed 4%, commercial buildings 1%, refrigeration 2%, landfills 4%, et cetera, et cetera. I've noted the one standout exception, electricity from coal. In 2023, only 2 other sectors contributed more than 10% of global emissions. Road transportation accounted for 16%, and agriculture accounted for 12%. Agricultural emissions are routinely broken down further into emissions from livestock and those from the cultivation of plant crops, each contributing 6%. I'd like briefly to mention one other specific complication before moving to acknowledgement of individual actions, and that concerns emissions from aviation. Here, estimates vary, ranging from 1% to 2.5%. Our World in Data, a research initiative, posts the 2.5% figure, but adds that it's not a whole story. When radiative forcing is taken into account, that's heat generated by contributions to atmospheric gases and pollutants by sources other than carbon dioxide. Think contrails. OWD says that aviation is responsible for 4% of global warming. This puts it on a par with emissions from landfills, well ahead of emissions from forestry, and only slightly behind emissions from cement and from steel. What then of the third step, acknowledging our contributions as individuals? What activities do most of us engage in that drive the drivers of biospheric collapse? The following list is by no means complete. Having children, flying for any reason but an emergency, getting on a diesel-powered cruise ship for any reason at all, buying a great big new gas-powered car, driving a gas-powered car when there are easily accessible alternatives like public transit, walking, or cycling, eating food imported by jet-fueled transport, eating food imported by refrigerated diesel transport, eating farmed meat. Methane from cattle is a significant contributor to rising emissions. Allowing food of any sort to rot in the cupboard or at the back of the fridge. Food waste globally accounts for somewhere between 6 and 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Eating or drinking takeout, which comes packaged in styrofoam, plastic, or cardboard. Using water in ways that aren't necessary to good health. Washing your car frequently. Watering your lawn. Flushing the toilet every time you pee. Washing your clothes when they aren't actually dirty. Showering for more than a couple of minutes. Jacking the thermostat rather than putting on a sweater. Jacking the air conditioner rather than lowering a blind. Frequent purchase of new clothes, particularly ones that decompose into microplastics. 85% of all textiles end up in the dump. Frequent purchase of upgrades to digital devices, reliance for entertainment and relief of boredom on technology that itself relies on data centers. Electricity consumption of data centers is rising rapidly and is projected to double to 3 to 4% of global consumption in the next few years. Buying items made of plastic or packaged in plastic when there are affordable alternatives, like taking your own bag. If you think recycling means you don't have to worry about plastic, you must think again. In the US, only 5 to 6% of the plastic taken in by recycling facilities is actually recycled. Most of it is sent for incineration or to landfills. I'm sure many of you can add to this list. The idea of the inventory isn't to generate defensiveness, but simply to uncover facts about how our own actions are implicated in collapse. Which of these activities, or others that they've brought to mind, do we engage in, and why? The question why is very important here. Again, the aim is not to stir defensiveness, but to get us wondering if change is possible. Did I buy that flown-in fresh asparagus from Peru because there was no other way to get the nutrition I needed? Or because I wanted a treat? Or because I saw it and didn't think much beyond, I like asparagus? If I wanted a treat, why? Because I was depressed? Because treats are one of the things I use to stave off the feeling I don't have anything else to do? What might I do to ease my depression? What might I do to give my life purpose? Ultimately, if we proceed with both care and honesty in a spirit of curiosity rather than self-accusation, we may discover areas in which we are indeed addicted to consumerism, where it's not poverty or systemic violence or a genuine absence of alternatives that prevent us from changing, but an inner need we can't control. Before we leave the inventory, I'd like to spend a little time with the first two items in the list: having children and getting on a plane. Asking humans to think about not having children is taboo in most circles. Having children is frequently regarded as an inalienable right about which questions cannot be asked. But if one knows it's true that the planet cannot sustain current numbers, having children appears not as a right, but as a privilege. As I mentioned earlier, economists wring their hands over what a decline in human population will do to the GDP. But the idea that GDP can expand endlessly forever on a planet with finite resources is a pipe dream, or not a pipe dream, it's a nightmare. A severe reduction in resource extraction is exactly what has been required for decades. If most humans are incapable of self-restraint, then we need fewer humans. Some, like Les Knight, who founded the voluntary human extinction movement 3 decades ago, have argued that we need no humans at all. The VHEM doesn't advocate killing ourselves off, but merely not reproducing. It asks us to acknowledge what is surely a fact. As a species, humans have functioned as a slow-moving, self-bloodying asteroid. I describe the movement's view here not to argue for it, but to move us past the taboo against talking about human overpopulation. If you cannot conceive of not having children, if you cannot bear the thought of the human species dying out, why? Because you've been taught that human life is infinitely valuable? If we look at the big picture, what is the evidence for that view? Or is it because you've been taught that having children is the route to a happy life? It's definitely a fact that we are sexed beings and that at a very deep level, many of us want to get pregnant or to make others pregnant. But getting pregnant and giving birth is different from raising children. I do not myself know a parent, including my own, who has not been anxious, frustrated, even despairing over the apparent direction of their child's development. A great many find themselves anxious, frustrated, and despairing because they've had to sacrifice the development of their own talents. Although many report delightful moments with their children, many also report disappointment, incomprehension, and sorrow. If we care about the planetary biosphere and seek integrity, it is time to sit calmly with these facts. What about flying for reasons other than emergencies? Again, it's considered a right, and challenging it can rouse people to fury. Here's an example, not of fury, but of the way in which recreational air travel remains exempt from concern, even among those who acknowledge the severity of the crisis. This is from an email I received recently from an acquaintance. Quote, "So much has been happening politically in the last while that the central environmental issues affecting our very being have been seemingly swept aside. Society fails to grasp what is most important in our troubled world. We need writers who will make us aware of the perils brought on by greed at the expense of the environment. It's been over a year since I retired, but I still manage occasional get-togethers with colleagues between travels to Cuba plus 2 cruises in the Caribbean. In a few days, I'll be returning to Cayo Coco, Cuba, for a couple of weeks of rest and sunshine. I hope to conclude my wanderlust urges this year with 2 more destinations, Turkey and a trip to Peru, Galapagos, Machu Picchu." The disconnect is remarkable because it's so explicit. Harder cases involve flying to fulfill family expectations. Do you absolutely have to go? Why? Who will suffer and how much if you don't show in person? Are you able to weigh the unhappiness of family or friends against the demands of biospheric crisis? Perhaps not, but it will be useful to understand why. Other hard cases involve flying because it's expected in your line of work. In the hardest of these cases, your employer may indicate that if you don't fly, you're going to lose your job. This last might qualify as a kind of emergency, especially if you have dependents and no other options for meeting your own and their needs for food and housing. But an employer who refuses to grasp that a biospheric crisis is unfolding is one that, as a person of integrity, you will want to move away from if you can. If you yourself know that a crisis is unfolding, you will ask seriously if there is alternative employment. The answer may indeed be no. And so on. The preceding discussion enumerates only a few of the scenarios and pressures that could arise as each of us undertakes to examine nothing more than our involvement with jet fuel. It's important to underline that the inventory as a whole, as I've sketched it, is just that, a sketch. Its general categories are vast. They too are vastly intertwined. Energy use, water use, subsistence, including food, clothing, tools, housing, healthcare, care for family members, and not least, maintaining sexual attractiveness. Cultural engagement, including education, what we do for work, and what we do for entertainment. I know, exhausting to contemplate. And so we come to the hardest question of all. If, as I've said, there's no chance of averting catastrophe, if putting in all that effort isn't going to solve biospheric crisis, why should we bother? If there's no chance of fixing things, what's the point? If everyone else is heading over the edge, why not go with them? It's an excellent question. I've suggested that what draws us to stand up, to take the first step towards integrity, is a desire for truth, a desire to live in the light of truth. But what is it about truth that's so attractive? Plato, as I indicated, thought that truth, moral behavior, and beauty were aspects of an integrated whole, and thus that it is truth's beauty that compels us. Why would anyone think this? There are so many truths that are ugly and horrifying. The fact that humans are committing planetary ecocide is one of them. I think the answer has to do with Plato's profound respect for mathematics. The experience of a basic proof in geometry or arithmetic can be electrifying. I've seen this repeatedly among students when I've pushed them to go through a proof step by step. No, don't just recite the formula. Why is the square of the hypotenuse equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides? When you go through the proof, there are audible gasps of astonishment, eyes widen, faces become intent. My sense is that this really noticeable physical reaction is rooted in a deep, intuitive sense that the relationships on which the proof depends could not be otherwise. When we grasp one of its classic proofs, the truth of the Pythagorean theorem doesn't strike us as a fact like I had oatmeal for breakfast, could have had toast, or Ottawa is the capital of Canada, when it might have been Toronto or Quebec City. Our experience of the proof is that the Pythagorean theorem is built right into the nature of right triangles in the Euclidean plane. I conjecture that it is truth of this sort that Plato had in mind when he claimed that truth is beautiful, truth whose hallmark is internal structural relationships. He further recognized that at least some of us who experience those internal structural relationships are affected in a way very like the way we're affected by great physical beauty. Our attention is riveted. We marvel. What we see literally takes our breath away. He knew that moral beauty, exemplified in his own life by Socrates, can have the same effect on us. It seems to share with mathematical truth a kind of necessity. Repeatedly, we find people who have behaved in morally beautiful ways with exceptional courage, for example, or compassion or generosity, saying that they had no choice. They could not have done otherwise. The structure of an integrated soul, then, appears to transmit goodness the way the structure of a mathematical proof transmits truth. It is that seamless integration of distinguishable aspects, knowledge, announced values, and action, that arrests our attention. Indeed, this kind of integration is what we mean when we say of anything that it's beautiful. Not that it possesses this or that color or this or that shape, but that it is characterized by startlingly resonant internal structural relations. And it is also the reason to attempt the hard work of moral integrity, even when it will not avert cataclysm. Integrity is beautiful, and beauty shares its structure with meaning. What is meaningful life about? The details will be different for different people. For some, it will be connection with other humans. But for this connection to be life-giving, people pursuing it must remain conscious of the profound interconnectedness of human community with the Earth's other than human communities. For others, meaningful life will involve pursuit of physical or intellectual or artistic adventure. And for yet others, it will be about the adventure of power and domination, unbridled expression of hominid aggression. What all these share is intensely focused attention. It is the exercise of such attention that is the mark of aliveness. When the capacity for attention is dulled by oversaturation of appetite, when it is dissipated by distraction, when it is denied an outlet in genuine work, aliveness shrivels, often to nothingness. It is then that many of us become afraid of death. And in some sense, rightly so, what we're experiencing and what ought to terrify us is the death of meaning. But in our dulled, distracted state, we confuse the death of meaning with the death of ourselves. The Buddhists are right. Life is full of pain, physical pain, emotional pain, intellectual bewilderment and struggle. But to attempt to smother that pain, to seek insensibility while continuing to breathe, is to elect death in life. There needs ultimately to be joy in the recognition that we can let go. Letting go is made easier when we conceive of community not as a congregation of humans, but as the ecology of being as a whole. When we understand ourselves to be aspects of that enormous integrated web of internal relations, flexing and unfolding over eons. Here's the conclusion of a poem called Carmel Point, in which Robinson Jeffers meditates on this perspective. The poem opens with a description of the land, once beautiful, now defaced by suburban development, and continues. Does it care? Not faintly. It has all time. It knows the people are a tide that swells and in time will ebb, and all their works dissolve. Meanwhile, the image of the pristine beauty lives in the very grain of the granite, safe as the endless ocean that climbs our cliff. As for us, we must uncenter our minds from ourselves. We must unhumanize our views a little and become confident as the rock and ocean that we were made from. If we unhumanize our views a little in this way, we attune ourselves to the immense depth and power of the world as a whole, its transhuman beauty. Moral integrity will then manifest as attempts to nurture and sustain this beauty, to avoid disrupting, disjoining, or dividing it from itself whenever possible. I mentioned that many humans find intense meaning in aggression and domination. They're not the only animals to do so, but they are unique in combining this expression of livingness with a fully opposable thumb. Biospheric moral integrity involves the ability to see that there are now too many of such humans riveted by love of war and exploitation for the species to be sustainable. Those individuals collectively cost the rest of the planet too much. They cause the species to assume the character of a sick molecule, in Robinson Jeffers' phrase. And here's an excerpt from the concluding stanza of another of his poems, De Rerum Virtute, which might be translated as of the excellence of things. One light is left us, the beauty of things, not men. The immense beauty of the world, not the human world. Look, and without imagination, desire, nor dream, directly at the mountains and the sea. Are they not beautiful? These plunging promontories and the flame-shaped peaks stopping the somber, stupendous glory, the storm-fed ocean. The beauty of things means virtue and value in them. It is in the beholder's eye, not the world? Certainly. It is in the human mind's translation of the transhuman intrinsic glory. It means the world is sound, whatever the sick microbe does, but he too is part of it. The last four lines are challenging. The claim is not that beauty is in the eye of the beholder because we know it's not out there in the world. Jeffers is saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder because the eye itself is part of the world, and it is therefore accurately constructed to reflect the world's nature. The most powerful evidence for this claim is the way we register the world's beauty. A second challenge, less easily resolved, is Jeffers' claim that the world is sound, whatever humans do to it. Jeffers wrote this poem in 1954, and he died in 1962. Would he have been as sanguine today? Not, I think, about the sea lions, the gulls, and the hawks, the tropical rainforests, and the polar ice, which also make appearances in his poem. But I think he would still insist on pointing to the granite cliffs and the storm-fed ocean. To choose now, as an individual, to walk the walk, to attempt to live coherently, to bring your actions into line with the claim that you care about the planet, and to pay alacritous attention to the planet's beauty, is to choose meaning. For that's what the experience of meaning is, the experience of the internal relations that constitute a whole. To choose meaning is to choose life with a flame-bright edge, to acknowledge the inseparability of love and suffering. It is not to do as everyone else does. It is not to go here with the tribe. The decision each of us faces is whether to insulate ourselves against awareness of our complicity or to stand up, called by the truth of the world's beauty, and attempt to emulate that beauty in ourselves. Thank you.